Hello, and welcome to Just Your Normal Missfit. I'm Ann Thomas, and every month I get to have conversations that remind me that inclusion is deeply personal. Today's episode is with someone who lives and breathes that truth, Pooja Sharma. Pooja is a neurodivergent adult and the founder of the Sarvodya Collective, which runs an ongoing campaign for neuro-inclusivity called Inclusive Duniya. Pooja's story weaves together so many lived experiences, growing up as a special sibling to a brother with intellectual disability, and then discovering her own neurodivergent identity. Through Sarvodaya, she's been creating a space for conversations that remind us that neuro-inclusion does not happen only through experts and policies. It happens when ordinary people like you and me step up as allies, as listeners, and as learners. This episode is a reflection on empathy, identity, and what it truly means to build an inclusive dunya, one that holds space for all kinds of minds. Pooja, thank you so much for being on Just Your Normal Misfit. It is our 16th episode, and we've almost done a year, so this is very special. I understand that you wear so many hats. You're a caregiver, you're a researcher, you're neurodivergent yourself, and the founder of Sarvodya Collective. Can you tell us more about that journey, please?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here. And now that you tell me that it's your 1 year episode or close to 1 year episode, it feels very special to me too. I'm really glad someone like you is having more of these conversations because it relates very much to the work that we do. So, my personal journey, I feel a little hesitant to use the tag of a caregiver. I am a sibling. I guess there is some care work involved as with any other sibling, there is some care work involved. I'm a sibling to somebody who has intellectual disability. It's something that I've seen all around me. My professional journey has been very much circuitous. It's something, as a cause, it felt very close to my heart. But I have followed a conventional route. Starting in corporate finance, my first job was with an investment bank, and I followed that route into corporate finance and strategy in a corporate. And I've spent about 15, 17 years doing that before I decided that I really needed to follow my heart and what felt like a calling to do more about the cause for neuro inclusion, which is when I quit my job and thought that I needed to plunge myself into the space and figure out what this looked like. So I have been working in the space broadly disability inclusion since 2020, and it's our fifth year.
Fabulous. And 2020, it takes me straight back to COVID
It
years.
is.
How was that
It
start?
was a very interesting start. It was a very dhamakedar start, if I may say so. Uh, so the journey actually started a little bit earlier when I decided I wanted to make the switch. I used to live overseas, live and work overseas, and then I quit my job and I moved here sometime in early 2019. But never having worked professionally in the disability space and never having worked fully in the social sector, I think it was a bit of a learning journey for me. So I started off with some consulting gigs mainly in education, which is the sector that I used to work in, but doing a couple of days with a school that worked on vocational training for adults with intellectual disabilities in Delhi. And that was my first learning ground, going from a sister's perspective to saying what really happens in the sector and what are the needs that need to be served. So while I was in that journey, obviously COVID struck 2020. And for me, it was very interesting because here was a sector I'd worked in education for almost a decade in the for-profit space, and I'd stepped into the not-for-profit space and in India. And education in India looked very different in 2020 than it did back in 2009 when I first left the country. There was a very thriving social sector and a lot of conversation about how the pandemic was going to impact educational equity and learning lags and what was going to happen girls versus boys or economic disadvantages, how were they going to surface in these learning lags that were bound to happen with the pandemic circumstances. I found that nobody was actually talking about the work that was happening or the work that needed to happen for folks with disabilities. That conversation was completely absent, even in that very active social sector discussions on how we needed to step up as a society. And that kind of prompted me to take more of an interest in what we can do. So that was the year I was turning 40. Interestingly, Captain Tom, who was based in the UK, he was turning 100, and he was walking 100 laps in his garden somewhere in the Midlands in England, trying to raise money for the NHS. And it became quite a story because he was this cute old man walking with his walker, and he ended up raising millions for the NHS. And it became like a real feel-good story through the COVID days. And that was also the time, as you will remember, everybody was doing all sorts of things. So somebody was doing sourdough, somebody was doing like 100 kilometers of cycling every day. So that's when I decided that I was going to turn 40, walking 40,000 steps in this room. I don't know if you can, how much of this you can see in the dark, but on my 40th birthday, I decided to walk 40,000 steps in this room. And because it was a bit of a crazy idea, a lot of people joined in. And by a lot of people, more than 80 people. So these are friends, friends of friends of friends of friends, somebody's cycling group, somebody's running group, and they came along. That sort of by default became the first awareness campaign that I ran. So through the month of August 2020, starting with my birthday, I put out a piece of content every single day that shared not just facts and figures, but also personal stories and helped shape one's perspective about what neurodiversity looked like in India. Because more of us needed to know about this. Someone saying it is not a mainstream issue was not good enough. So to help build that understanding on what the nature of the issue is and was important. So I was putting out a piece of content for 31 days, and more than 80 people from across India, 12 different cities, walked, cycled, ran, did push-ups, and spread the word. That's where I learned. That was the first campaign I ran and the first comps piece of work that I ran. But it was hugely exciting. It was hugely energizing. And that became the seed of the idea that is today's Sarvodya.
That's really exciting to begin with. I'm going to focus on one of the things that you spoke about, which is learning about what disability look like in a space that you said education so high intense, and you go in there and disability is always an afterthought in every piece that we look at. You first create the curriculum, you first create the spaces, and then you say, oh, but what about that child, or what about this person? It's never something that is included as we talk about. What were those stark things that you learned when you made the shift from the profit to the nonprofit space? What were some of those stark ideas?
Which, at least in the education space, it was working on something that was not disability focused. But that is also really interesting because when I first approached, people and said we needed to do more about this, and as a country, we were at that point starting to make a shift towards talking about foundational learning. So foundational learning and numeracy, which is like a big focus area for us as a country now, that was a conversation that was just about starting then. And our thesis is that if 80 to 85% of the people of children can be accommodated in a mainstream, that accommodation or that work needs to happen through the earlier years. If we can actually work with children between the ages of 3 to 8 and integrate them into the mainstream education system, it's easier for them to continue through that. So there was clearly an overlap, but this was not something that, like you said, that was not part of the conversation. So the project I was working on was inclusion on socioeconomic disadvantage. It wasn't on the disability space. And so to me, one of the most surprising things was that we were actually not having this conversation. So we as a country, the Right to Education Act, like while we've been talking about inclusion since sometime in the 1960s, through various acts and papers and recommendations that have come out, actually the Right to Education Act in 2009 promised that every single child until the age of 14 needs to be in school. The fact that there's so many children who are left out and we don't even know who those children are is a little bit shocking. And I think since then, there's a Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act that's come again that promises education. The National Education Policy has focused on inclusion, and you can see some green shoots of movement that's happening towards working towards inclusion, but that's recent. So when I was starting out in 2019-20, I was just surprised that despite all of this positive policy framework, nobody was actually designing an inclusion from the outset. Like you said, it's always an afterthought. And if it's just an afterthought, it becomes difficult to accommodate. How are we going to have this child in the classroom when we have a classroom of 50? But the fundamental question is, does a classroom of 50 serve the other 49 too? You know, it probably doesn't. So, like with everything else, if we design to include everyone, the solution is better not just for those ones who are left out, but also for everyone who's already present in the mainstream.
The whole idea that we're designing for 50 and then we think about that other one child, I think itself is a wrong mindset, right? Because we are actually designing for 50 different people coming from very different families with different experiences, different nutrition levels. There is no designing for 50. There has to be designing for one among 50 and looking at all aspects. That is something that constantly gets lost in the conversation. And as you rightly put, we really need to integrate it, and I think that's what Sarvodya has been working since the past 5 years now. So tell us about that journey, about Sarvodya.
We started focusing on education as a thing about 3 years back. So while as an organization, we're 5 years old when we first started out, because it started off as a inadvertently designed awareness campaign. I think what happened through those conversations in August 2020, everybody was like, "Iska matlab kya hai?" And someone should do something about it. Actually, now that I know this is a problem, why is no one doing anything about it? This is something the government should do or something an NGO should do. And this is the order of things: government, NGO, doctor. In तीनों को कुछ करना चाहिए. We're not realizing that positive policy framework actually becomes real when individuals step up. So that is where we started talking about, what an individual's role is and starting work on cultivating allyship. But that work took us more into school spaces. And when we were going into school spaces, some teachers, after we were done with the session with the students, come to us and say, "Hey, I feel this child might have additional needs, or, उनको ADHD hai, ki, dyslexia hai, or is it that they've not been in school for 2 years? Through the COVID years, and that is why they've gotten out of the habit, or we're not able to actually have them settle in." So these were the kind of questions that started coming in, and in responding to those questions, we actually realized that it is very important. While we think that neurodivergent people are not making it into the classroom, actually they are, and that number, that 85%, because it's an invisible disability and it's not something that you would necessarily pick up, they make it into the mainstream classroom, and in not being able to serve their learning needs. We're not serving them as their life outcomes. So it's not just learning outcomes that are being failed, it is also the potential life outcomes that are being failed. So our work started off by first addressing the questions that were coming from teachers, then realizing that there's enough flow of inbound questions to actually require more formal teacher training around this, because teachers have not gone through, they do not know. Even in psychology, you have a paper on abnormal psychology, and that is that. So to build that understanding, to say what does inclusive education look like, it is not something that's an afterthought, but how do you pick up those practices? What is it that you need to know? What are the signs that you need to pick up? So our training is designed around helping people understand that every child is an individual, their learning needs are individual. The system is designed in such a way that, it feels it's one size fits all, but there are small tweaks that we can actually make to accommodate the unique needs of all children, not just children with disabilities. You do not need a label to be able to offer support. You need to understand a child to offer support to them. So a lot of our training is designed around that. It takes into account the universal design for learning principles, which is not designing for that one child who's left out. It's saying all of them, for all the reasons you're talking about: malnutrition, different backgrounds, different languages. We all live in cosmopolitan cities. So we all speak a different language at home. What does that look like? How does that translate to learning needs in the classroom? For somebody who has English as a first language, to Kannada as a first language, to Hindi as a first language, when you go into a classroom and you're studying in English, what does that look and how do you support that? So variances take different forms, but how do you support those variances when it comes to neurodiversity?
We are constantly focused towards learning and how a child performs in an exam, or if the child is doing well in terms of marks. That's about our interest levels. I love the idea of inclusive dunya, where you're not just talking about one aspect of a certain person, but the overall. And it's about what you mentioned, like doing well in life altogether. Does the person have friends? Because with neurodivergence, that's the most difficult piece of their day to day, right? Just feeling involved, just feeling included, just feeling that sense of belonging. And we all know how important sense of belonging is to thrive. I'm just thinking how that criteria is completely missed out constantly. Can you tell us how you've been working through that and how inclusive dunya came about in terms of creating this sense of
Absolutely,
belonging?
very happy to. Um, so Inclusive Dunya started as a comic project. So, and while As sad and difficult as the pandemic was, I think this was one of those gifts, those blessings in disguise that it encouraged me to do something so unconventional. So all the questions that came through in the campaign we were running in 2020, we took those questions knowing that आप अगर lecture देंगे or if you hand out a fact sheet, those are not ways to actually build awareness. So we took the questions that were coming in, distilled them down to 21 themes, and decided next year to commemorate the August campaign, we would put out 21 illustrated stories that talk about, in this beautiful, lighthearted way, actually talk about what neurodivergence looks like or how people can show up. Because the first question is, what does it mean? What can I do about it? There's so much that one can do about it. At the policy level, you need to do stuff. That needs to change. Systems need to change, but the systems are made up of people. So the reality and actually actualizing it and implementing it comes down to individuals. As an individual, you can do small things, offer a smile, hold out the door, invite your child, make sure that your child's birthday party has all the children in the neighborhood included, not leaving them out. And yes, everyone has favorites, but who's the one who's getting left out? Be a little bit more curious, observant about what's going on. So the comic started off with hitting those themes. How do you show up as a friend and an ally? What does it mean in an illustrated story manner? And how can you show up as a friend and an ally? When we started putting out the comic, it was really surprising because through that time I'd been experimenting with a bunch of things and engaging with the community. But it's when I started putting out the comic on Instagram that we started receiving a lot of positive feedback. So there were parents and siblings who were reaching out saying, this is exactly how we want to talk about disability. You're not pussyfooting around the issue. You're not being tentative talking about it. You're being very straightforward about what the issue is, but you're doing it in a respectful, kind way and a way that's positive and feels good. And we want to talk about this and our needs in that manner. So parents started asking, can I actually use this content to run awareness events or awareness sessions or sensitization sessions in my community? Because the kind of non-inclusion challenges across the board were pretty similar. मेरे बच्चे को birthday पे नहीं बुलाया. My child went down to play and got on the merry-go-round and everyone left. And all of these things are things that any of us would feel bad about. So, anyways, responding to all those inbound queries, we designed something called the Inclusive Duniya Circle. We're like, if this is a need, then can we actually design something that's a loosely structured template, but actually takes someone on a learning journey, talking about what neurodiversity is, expanding one's understanding from saying disability is something that's less than in someone to saying actually neurodiversity, it is a diversity of abilities, but let's understand it as a social model of disability, that it's a condition as well as the environment in conjunction that create a disabling experience. And if it's the environment, which is also made up of the people, what can we do as allies to make that a more enabling environment? So, what is our role as allies? And when I say our, I don't mean the collective our, the individual are. So, what is my role as Pooja and what is your role as Anne? And these might be two different things because our worlds and our day to days look very different, but helping people connect with the idea of neurodiversity and their role as an ally in that individual way. So, we designed the circle format and started running that with family advocates, so parent advocates and sibling advocates. And then somewhere along the way, it struck me this is one of those areas where only people impacted by disability actually show up and talk about it. But how do you bring other people in? Because the problem is we're going out and saying we need to change you, but actually, can we make them more active participants in this? Because people don't mean well. Can we actually help them do better by working alongside them? That very much is at the heart of what we do at Inclusive Dunia. Like our ethos is very much saying, how do we get on the same side of the table and in good faith work with you to help you do better, to be more inclusive? So we started working with volunteers from colleges, from communities, and getting them to facilitate these sessions. The intent was with these sessions, the volunteers and the volunteer facilitators go on a transformational journey. And as a secondary deliverable, you can see I come from a corporate background, but the secondary outcome, the children, the 9 to 12-year olds that are part of the circle also go through a transformative journey because they are inherently inclusive. So what they need is to actually have some facts, figures, or active data points to structure their thinking or give form to their this fuzzy feeling of inclusivity and really bed that down. But for the facilitator in running those sessions, they've gone through a bit of a learning journey. They're facilitating those conversations. And when you hear from from a child's mouth, how they very easily hang a question mark on things that we adults hesitate with. ऐसे क्यों है कोई Olympics थोड़ी खेल रहे हैं गेम का रूल बदल दो. And that is a very simple way to be inclusive, right? The adults would be like, no, these are the rules, and so you can't play. But a child would be like, just change the rules of the game. The second piece that we were doing was actually running these circles, and we started running these circles at scale using volunteer facilitators. And while we were doing that, we ended up in school spaces. So I've already talked about the teacher training journey. But the other piece is that teachers may not have the capacity to run inclusive classrooms. So the second, like you talked about, having a sense of belonging in the classrooms, I think students play a very important role. If a child does not get seen, teacher could be doing anything they want, but if at break time वो अकेले बैठ के lunch खा रहे हैं, then they don't feel like going to school and it doesn't feel like a second home to them. And it is the first space in our life that we step out of the cocoon of our homes and families and step out into the world. So it is important to make that space inclusive, both for the neurodivergent as well as the neurotypical. So we also take some of these formats into mainstream schools and work with student leaders. So we will work with high schoolers to get them to run some of these circles around our comic. We've designed full social emotional learning curriculum that they can then use with younger students so that the school culture starts changing in a way that matters to them. Because again, with every school, the diversity looks different and the issues may be different. So in some school, it may be that kids are being left out the, to eat lunch. In another, it may be that they don't get to travel on the bus. But whatever are the issues actually get tackled because it's the students who are leading that conversation. And when students are leading those conversations, younger children are more inclined to hear what a cool bhaiya or didi is saying from their high school because that's what they aspire to versus what teacher is saying or what a adult from the outside is saying. So as a model, this works really well, getting involving high school students and shifting that school culture. So with the teacher training and the student work, it starts shifting the school culture.
It's interesting. It's like when we talk about feminism and we say that we need feminism and all the women will fight for feminism. But if the men don't come along, it doesn't make sense because it's just 50% of the entire community. We need the neurotypicals to participate. We need the neurotypicals to speak up for the neurodivergent, for those who cannot speak for themselves, for those who do not even understand what they're going through, forget even get the vocabulary. I think that comes much later in their lives. They only know what the feeling is that I am not included, I am not seen as the other children are, I am not being spoken with before the diagnosis, the words and the labels, all of that come later, and sometimes even as adults today. So having allies is so important, and this whole work that you're doing towards building allies. Uh, what made you go and say, I need to have more allies, and being an ally is the way to go forward? What was the magic there?
I think one, like you said, you talked about feminism. So I would not go so far as to say feminism as well. I would say just, women in the workplace. What women of our generation have experienced is very different from what maybe the kind of opportunities women even 10 years before us or our mothers had. So our mother's generation, most of the women in India at least were school teachers. If they were career women, they were school teachers. And in, ours is probably the first generation that's in such large numbers gone into the workplace. And I think at some point, any of us would have seen the benefit of having an ally, someone who turned around in the boardroom and said, what is it that you were saying? Or taking a minute extra. And sometimes as a woman, sometimes in my case, given my career trajectory, I was also the youngest person in a lot of meetings and conversations where some saw the value in that because that was the role, but some questioned it. What is a 25-year-old doing here? But having benefited from someone just doing something really small to allow my voice, my opinion, my input to come in and weigh in on whatever was being discussed, I saw the benefit of having allies in that way. I think the second thing that is a lot more personal and a lot more directly related to this issue is that my elder brother, he worked in the hospitality industry. And we were all very delighted when he got that job. But at some point, we realized that there was some element of bullying, let's just call it bullying, happening. They were using the word pagal. And as a sister, it just made my blood boil. But the circumstances were such that this was the first formal job he had that was not a sheltered job, that was out in the world. He felt really good about it. It gave a structure to his day, it gave a routine, and he didn't want to quit it. So when you're in that sort of situation, none of us would choose to send somebody into a situation where they might be bullied. So how do you change that? So the professional in me is thinking you need to have more trainings, etc. But आप ट्रेनिंग से किसी की सोच नहीं बदल सकते because this is something that's a little bit more fundamental. You can go through a 1 hour training every 6 months, code of conduct trainings, but that is not how you change attitudes, mindsets, and beliefs in the value that another individual brings. That starts when we're much younger. As a country, as a culture, we know how to do that. We just need to expand that to say, अगर हम बड़ों का, like, with our grandparents, when they stop contributing that much value or need some help or a little bit more time, if we are able to organically step up without anyone instructing, can we do the same with another? And how do you help shift those mindsets? Does this need to be only for neurodivergent people or does it need to be for the others? So that as an experience, that inner churning, there is a helplessness, but there's also anger. And how do you channelize that into something that says, I may not be able to change this for my sibling, but can I work on something that might mean that in 15 years' time, fewer people like him are facing this sort of verbal abuse. And I think this kind of comes from, and that's where working with younger children comes from. Like, can we get them to think differently, act differently, and bed those more positive behaviors down with greater information about neurodiversity and make them a little bit more open and accepting?
At my workplace, we're a group of 5 or 6, and it keeps changing. I'm a parent. Somebody is single, somebody just newly married. There are a lot of differences. Somebody has an ailing parent, somebody has. So everybody comes from different circumstances, and the rule is simple, right? There will be times that one of us is not at their best because that's our day to day. There is a time when the pressures from home are bigger, or I am not mentally up to certain things or emotionally doing well. Whenever that happens, you check in with me and you pull up for me so that when you are down, then I know I need to pull it up, and we work with each other. So the team never gets impacted because one person is not doing too well. At the same time, that person can get a breather. I think that's really worked. It was something that we've been working for a year, and that it has translated into something wonderful because nobody externally ever knows the challenges of my internal team. Each one of us has had moments where we are really dipping and survived it. So I completely get why you say that it's a conditioning that can happen with time. And when we talk to younger kids and when we go back into the classrooms and say, is there some way that we can do this differently? That conversation
Yeah.
always happens. Whenever we think about being a special sibling, we always tend to feel very sorry for them. It's an unfortunate thing, right? Oh, poor child, so much responsibility, so many things that they have to carry. Either we are oblivious or we are feeling sorry. I really want you to tell us, Pooja, how that experience has been, because as a special sibling, what are the highlights of your relationship and how has that impacted your day to day?
What are the highlights of my relationship? Um, I think receiving pure love, pure anger too sometimes, but
Or emotion?
emotions, knowing that, there isn't a filter, but a love or care that is really soft in a way that, one doesn't get in the world today. And I say this as a, 40 something year old, and I probably did not fully appreciate this as an 8, 9-year old. One of my big memories is my father was in the army, so we used to be like posted in all of these other cantonments. And every summer we would pick up we had a little Maruti 800, and we would pick up that Maruti 800, and with three siblings, not two. So the three of us would pack in at the back, and we would drive down to from wherever we were to Delhi to visit the grandparents. And no air cons. I'm talking like late 80s, 90s. So no air cons or anything. Summer ki heat. And my brother would allow me to sleep on his shoulder. We would take turns sitting, who was sitting in the middle. And when I would sit in the middle, I had two brothers on either side, and it was always my middle brother, Vishal, would allow me to sleep on his shoulder. And I think that, and when I would get up, he would like gently rub off the sweat, very easily sleep in the cars. And I think that thing, you need this, and I'll give it to you, and I'll give you this care. I think that's been a highlight. He's the brother who always shops for lucky gifts. And they may be really small gifts. Started off with hair clips and stuff like that, but he would make a trip to the shops on his own, try and keep it secret, and then go and shop and choose something on his own and bring back. I think that kind of care, individual care, that's been very nourishing emotionally for me. I think seeing someone celebrate my wins without any, and this is not to say my other brother doesn't, because he also really just is very joyful when something good happens with me. But I think with Vishal as well, receiving that he's always happy. And the celebrations are simple, but they're sweet, like making tea. So I remember there was a time we were, and this is interesting because this is complex as well, because we were, we'd had a little tiff, and like any siblings do, तो इतना हमारा थोड़ा सा cold war चल रहा था, like we were not having the warmest conversations. I was traveling away for 3 weeks, and on the morning I was supposed to go, he got up early, made me a cup of tea, and he said, "Why don't you come and have tea before you go?" And we sat down and had tea. And the fact that tea is his love language, making tea is his love language, is also just the sweetest thing. So the highlights are the simple joys of everyday life that people think we may not be at the receiving end of, because when people think about disability, they're thinking that it's a one-way flow, but it is not a one-way flow. When I'm the saddest, I feel most held and most supported when he holds my hand. And I feel most cared for when he comes up with these simple but meaningful gestures because he knows I like his chai.
Was it very difficult as a child? Because with one son who's neurodivergent, he takes a lot more attention and emotion compared to my neurotypical. For me, with the neurotypical, it is easier. I am an easier person, but here I want to get it right. There's a lot more pressure that I put on myself to get him to fit in. So I imagine, as someone who grew up with a mom or dad paying more attention to the child who's neurodivergent, what are the challenges that have been as a sibling to somebody like that?
I never felt those challenges when I was younger. Um, I really didn't. But everything that you've said, I now recognize as an adult that my mother went through that journey. So, like every night she would do speech therapy with him. I think one of the things that I wanted without really ever feeling resentful or holding against her was a little bit more time with her, because I would feel like every night uh, वो उसके साथ speech therapy कर रही है, but and every night each of us would get a good night kiss, but he would also get those 20 minutes extra of the speech therapy. I knew he needed that, so I didn't resent it. But as an adult, I do reflect on it and I think, was there something there that my child brain rationalized and did not recognize? And where does that show up? Obviously, being in that environment where I saw my mother stepping forward with that care, where she was enabling him. And this is also, again, back in the 80s and early 90s, where things were not so easily available. So for her to go away for a bit, educate herself, and then come back and play therapist wherever we were posted, and make sure that he is able to go out into the world. I have learned that when you show up in care, you have to show up in care like that. But at that point in time, did I want more? I don't really know. I do think about this often. It is interesting. The Inclusive Duniya comic, the first 21 stories have been painted by somebody who was a classmate in grade six, grade seven and eight with me. And we reconnected after many years through the COVID years. And she was a marketer by profession and she'd quit that job. And she was just as a hobby doing watercolor paintings. And I asked her, so she was doing landscapes, and I asked her, would she try doing characters, because I have this idea and I want to translate this and I don't know where to look for an artist, but it would actually be really lovely because I loved her watercolors. She used to doodle a little bit back when we were in school. She was like, yeah, I'll try it. It was interesting that she said that when we had club evenings, I saw that you always took Bhaiya with you, and you never left him. So whether it was we were playing tambola or we were playing Pakran Pakrai, you always were with him and made sure that he came along. And it is not something that it's obviously something I would have done, but that somebody else played it back to me and observed it as a third person um, was interesting to me. That it just felt like it's something that I had to do, but it also look out for him. But that another 13-year-old observed it and then said, I'm going to do this with you now because I know how much it matters to you because I saw you doing that at 13. It was interesting to me. So, yeah. So I guess even at that age, there was some stepping up that was happening, which would probably,
Yeah.
which a neurotypical sibling may not have done.
That's a very interesting piece that you've said. And I'm very curious because you clearly say
Yeah.
you're three siblings. How does that work? And what have you seen with that relationship and the dynamics that the siblings play? You know, you're neurodivergent in a certain way. Your brother, of course, has intellectual disability, and you have a third person. How was that relationship?
I haven't actively articulated this before. I think it was interesting when we were growing up because we're all roughly 3 years apart. Between me and my elder brother, there was a significant enough age gap for him to be like an elder brother figure or somebody who's maybe making up, or he's also a bit of a softie and, very caring. So he was that figure at that point in time. The brother who would come in, say, बहुत अच्छा है, you know, but also the brother who would say, you're not going to come play cricket with us. So in that sense, so he was very like, I'm going to play cricket with my friends and you're going to go away and do whatever you're doing. And there, I think Vishal and I would be a little bit more involved. We would play badminton together, or we used to learn cycling from the same guy. So we would share a cycle. So I think growing up, it was like that. My elder brother was away for some bit because he went away to college and work and everything. Because so he was also 1 year ahead of his class. He was technically 7 years ahead. So he went away fairly early on when we were still in school. So Vishal and I were more together. It's interesting now because we live together and I do the work that I do. And I am just by virtue of having this interest, I've chosen to do this work. And because I'm doing this work, there is more information that I have. But the brothers live together and I live in a separate flat in the same building, but the brothers live together. So the actual day-to-day care responsibilities fall with the elder brother. So it's a team thing now where I may have more information, but for anything to take effect, it has to be something where I need to go share with him and get him to do or recruit his support. It keeps us working together as a team.
Was that a very understood clear decision that he would be the caregiver? How have these roles changed over the years with your parents, with you and the siblings taking care of each other? How has that shifted?
I lived overseas for a period of time. So and I think the expectation was that I would continue doing that. So when at some point I think my father was thinking about guardianship, you need a guardian who's local. In that sense, this was the most obvious way to do this. Because he was in the forces and there are family benefits that my brother could have inherited. It was an arrangement that needed to be made in a timely manner so that it could be set up for administrative reasons. But the second piece is, what does care look like? And care between, because it's also very easy for us to talk about what care looks like between somebody who's neurodivergent and neurotypical. But actually, when you have three siblings, how do each of us show up and care for each other? And I think there is also this assumption that the neurodivergent sibling will not show up in care. But like I said, it was Vishal who was offering me his shoulder to sleep on, or it was him who said, have tea before you go. Or it is him, like there was this one time my elder brother was hospitalized and it just, I mean, it was unexpected and it happened. So I came home, and when I came home, Vishal was up late at night and I rushed back from wherever I was, but he was up waiting for me. As soon as I walked in, he looked at me, held out his hand, and it felt like coming home and feeling whatever it was, whatever energy it was with which I came back, returned home. It was he held out his hand and he did say, "Ye kya ho gaya?" But it was him, also offering like, now we're together. But, staying up until midnight waiting for me to come back was also care. And I think there is this thing that kind of goes around, and we're talking about siblings, but then there's a fourth element. My elder brother's married. So there's his wife too. And I think a lot of the practicalities or the day to day is something as the lady of the house that fall on her. Amongst the four of us, each of us plays a role. We're all distinct personalities, but each of us shows up in different ways for the other. So, for example, for all my emergency contacts, I always put my bhabhi's number because I know that if somebody is going to call, she's the one who's going to pick up the phone and show up. Everyone plays a different role, including Vishal.
And in terms of the relationship, and there is this dynamic that already exists. There's the three of you, and there is this caregiving role. And there is, how does somebody who has not experienced that come in and adjust to and become an ally now, so much so that she is your emergency contact? Clearly, there's a lesson there for everyone to pick on.
Um, I think they've been married for a while, 20 plus years. So there's been some time. But I think this is an important element also, that I think when a neurodivergent or from a neurodiverse pair, when a siblings getting married, I find that both me and my other brother, it was always part of the criteria, always saying with any potential partner, saying, by the way, this is my life story. If this is getting serious, then this is an element that you need to be aware of. It's interesting because one does not feel the need to say something like that when it comes to caring for parents, but with caring for siblings, it felt like an important disclosure to be made relatively early on. My elder brother and my sister-in-law, they got married in a arranged marriage setup, so this was something that was very clear from the outset. But actually getting somebody on and onboarding them, so we've organically grown and seeing my mother do speech therapy every night imbibe the model of care in me, which is part of my value system. But for somebody who theoretically feels like I understand this, but what does this look on a day-to-day basis? What is happening when there may be a tricky situation or an unpleasant situation that you may not have anticipated? You have a 6-month-old child and somebody who needs care. What does that look like? I think we all step up. There is an assumption of good faith on her part, and she does her part, but she also sees what's going on and takes on those values. And I think there is a fair bit of credit to be given to her because she's worked to understand Vishal and establish that relationship with him. So उसको मजाक अच्छा लगता है या वो टेंशन करता है तो it would lead to, if he's stressed out, it can lead to an epileptic seizure and stuff. So she is probably the best placed to dispel that with some light jokes. But this is something she probably learned 7, 8 years into her marriage, that this is a role she could play because of her sense of humor or, you know, or the dynamic amongst the 4, 5 of us.
You mentioned how relationships can be tricky. How has that been for you in terms of you've been married and then realized that there was a neurodivergent partner and you yourself being a neurodivergent partner? How tricky was relationship building over the years personally for you?
Tricky. Which is why probably I now I'm single for a very long time, and I realize that it takes the capacity to give, and sometimes I don't. So I'm going through a phase in life where I don't at the moment. Interestingly, with my marriage, at that point, neither of us knew we were neurodivergent. So we just had, we came from two very different worlds, and without dwelling into it too much, I think the ability as a neurodivergent person, if you see the world in a relative black and white and not so much of the gray, if one's version of black and another's version of black is different, in that binary, those two binaries fitting in, it can bring its challenges without anyone being an unworthy partner potential. So I think there was that, but we realized later on, after we split up, that he was neurodivergent. He was autistic. And that was a very interesting journey because while we split up, it was not acrimonious. We remained friendly. The Economist had done an issue on autism. So they've recently done an issue on ADHD, and suddenly the understanding of what ADHD has gone mainstream, but that happened also with autism in 2015. So here I was on a Sunday afternoon flipping through that magazine and thinking, oh my God, this sounds just like him. And so I texted him and I said, I'm going to save you this copy so you can look through it. And he looked through it, and in really small ways. How does walking in leather-soled shoes feel? So we lived in London, and London has cobbled streets. So leather-soled shoes on cobbled streets. Why is that so difficult? Why is a bedside lamp going on difficult? Why are certain noises difficult? Why is not being able to find a parking spot difficult? These all seem like really ordinary things. Together, it just felt, oh, there is an explanation for this. It's not that you're being fussy or difficult. There actually is an explanation for all of this, and we never knew about this. And this is where I think, going back to your first question, the need for greater awareness also came from this, that if we had known, would we have shown up differently in the relationship? We probably would have, because I grew up in a family where we accommodated additional needs. and I was conditioned to. But it is interesting because at that point in time, I thought if there was a label attached to it, would I have shown up differently? Whereas I have gone through a journey now saying there is no need for the label. We should make space for everyone. But at that point, I felt like this would have been different if I knew that there were additional needs involved. The labels. Interesting you say this, fighting for labels, because it's only when I saw a label that I could attach to my ex-husband could I go like, actually, you were not being difficult. This is what you needed. And I wish somebody had said, here's a checklist of 8 things that we must do his way because this is important. Could I have worked around that? But did I need to? But I think that label led to greater understanding. And for my own journey, I think even having gone through and we worked and figured it out together, but for me, I realized that I might be neurodivergent in 2020 only when I started working on this issue and reading more that I started correlating that if I get anxious in a way that I feel it in my body when I'm in a crowd or it's too noisy, then maybe I have a sensory sensitivity and I should not ignore it. And when my parents said that जब pressure cooker की सीटी बजती थी, Pooja would cry always as a baby. Maybe they were hearing it differently than I was. And just like putting it, stitching it together for my own self actually came another 5 years later. So even when we went on that journey with him, I never allowed myself that courtesy because I think I was in an environment where these were not um, issues that I faced on a day-to-day basis. Whereas having come back to India, there is a lot like, सारा honk करते हैं. Like, and I don't mean to sound like a total NRI, and I have to justify that too, but like, why is everyone honking? Because it may not make someone as anxious, but it actually makes me very anxious. So I need to have my windows rolled up and not be exposed to that. Or I drive my car even for 3 hours without any music playing because I like the silence of the car. And how do you explain this to someone? And it's very interesting because my dad loved watching Arnab Goswami. And when he would visit me, he would want to watch whatever his late evening 9 p.m. show was, even in the UK. So I had to set up Temps Now and set that up. And he would insist on it. But once we had this conversation that I feel overwhelmed by loud noises or a certain kind of energy, it was really sweet because, in a way, it was a very simple gesture. But every time I would go down to see him, he would turn off the TV. I would walk in and he would turn off the TV. And it was just this one simple act. But that is what allyship looks like too. I now understand that is your need, and I'm going to make sure that consistently that's going to happen for you.
I grew up in Delhi. So noise is something that I've lived with. I did the Haryana roadways back and forth to school. Noise, people, you grow up with that. You can understand that. It's just a part of you and you don't realize that. And it's only much later now that I have lived with Thomas for so long that I know that a room is loud and this place is loud, and can you please roll up the windows? When you said roll up the windows, you know exactly what you're talking about, because it is loud. For me, it was so normalized that this is the amount of sound that is normal, and now the sensitivity has come to that side that why are you honking? You don't even need to honk. The journey of just looking at the world through somebody else's eyes is really really an eye opener, and sometimes you just don't know what somebody else is going through and how difficult just this tiny little noise in the background could be for somebody else. I also see gender as a big piece. You're the only girl, and I want to understand how that played out in terms of your neurodivergence and the conditioning that we have as women of how much we can ask for, not ask for, how much space you take, how much is you being too pushy or not pushy. What are your thoughts around that?
Gender, I mean, in my family for sure, because I'm the only sister, and so besides my mother, it was just me. I think gender is generally an issue as well. Women are conditioned to mask, and I'm using the mask word mask very, very broadly. What would you ask for? How much space would you take? कहाँ पे आप adjust करोगे? Are you expected to be bubbly in certain circumstances and a little coy in others? And would you play that role because you're expected to play that role? Women go through that. And and I have grown up in a very Punjabi setup where saying I'm gonna actually go back to my room and read instead of sitting here and being really bubbly when there's 20 visitors in the house was not okay. So I think I got very conditioned to presenting in a particular way where I'm very extroverted, I'm very happy to see you. It is not draining me at all. I think it was not an expectation from the immediate family. It was more broadly the environment that, whether it's movies or the cultural environment, but it expects women to show up in a particular way, and women inherit that. And that gets in the way of women getting diagnosed too. So while I think, like with all medical issues, how conditions present in women, like a lot of research is done on men, and a lot of women-specific issues are not um, tackled. I think the cultural element has a very big role to play. And it's very difficult to unpick after a certain stage what is the problem. So, which is why I feel like maybe just understanding what our needs is and getting a little bit more self-aware and making space for that is more important than trying to find out if there's a diagnosis or a label that will explain our journey. Because for a lot of adult women, finding a diagnosis is difficult because where do you unpick the cultural conditioning you've been doing for 30 years? And the mental health issues that it leads to, by the way, as well, because anxiety and depression is prevalent in neurodivergent women to a much higher degree.
I love that we've gone into masking, because a big part of our lives as women, as I think even as Indian children, the conditioning that you have a ghar ka naam and you have a bar ka naam, right? You have a pet name and you have a name for official purposes. And I think that spills over into every piece of our lives. That's a lot of conditioned vigilance. And then you have to train yourself to step back and hold back to start breathing better. It is a journey. What does an ally mean, if you had to say that in
Um,
2 minutes?
I think to me, an ally is someone who's curious and who's respectfully curious, not curious as in um, here's this model that I need to study, but who's respectfully curious about the person that they're engaging with and is able to make space for their needs. I think curiosity is important. So I think the willingness to learn, the willingness to share, the willingness to speak up if you see something wrong happening, that's important. The willingness to be kind in both speaking up for someone, but speaking up and setting something right. I think kindness is important. And then being able to give your time, resources in whatever way the cause needs and be actively involved with that's also allyship in small ways. Like I said, my father would switch off the TV if I came in because he knew I did not like loud noises. But there are micro actions you can take on a day-to-day basis. Is somebody sitting alone and would you ask them, would you like to join us? Would you make space? Would you bring back a coffee? Would you ask them how their weekend was? Would you do a check-in? Would you make sure that they were included in a birthday party or a trip that you were planning? Would you make sure that their social needs, not just their physical needs, are taken care of? And it's a roti kapda makan nahi, but also what their emotional needs are. Would you show up in conversation and give them an extra minute to finish what they're saying and show interest and cultivate that interest? I think all of those are also small acts of allyship that don't take very much from our side. It does not take coming from a very informed place, it just takes coming from a respectful and kind place. I use the word kind not in a charitable sense, but broadly compassionate place.
One of the things that you said to me in our earlier conversation, it has stayed with me that whenever there is a need, and when we talk about LGBTQI, when we talk about different communities come together and they speak up and talk together, it's a problem for everybody. But when we talk about disability, it's usually just the parents, the siblings who are fighting for themselves. It's a very lonely journey. I just want you to share that piece of your experience over the past 7 years of how you have come to understanding and looking at that and what you'd like seeing change about that.
Is nobody outside of the disability community was talking about this. So pretty much all the organizations in this sector are organizations that have been set up and run by, powerhouse moms. And it's no other need of any marginalized community is such that it is fulfilled only by people within. And it's empowering. But at the same time, the fact that this parallel world that exists is not okay. I think trying to bridge those two worlds has been the work that we do at Inclusive Dunia. So making sure that we represent the needs and the stories of our community so that the neurotypical world understands what these needs may be and understands how that space could be made, not on a DEI day, but on a day-to-day basis. What does that look like? Not attaching a label or going and doing something on one day. In a school, it is important to have a resource room, but it is also important to have an inclusive classroom. So, making sure that those needs are represented, but also knowing that nobody means to be non-inclusive. They genuinely do not know. That capacity building work, there's so much of our focus is on building the capacity of folks with disability that we don't necessarily step out and say, what is it going to take for the rest of the world that is as well meaning as it is to be able to meaningfully engage? So our work has become about taking these stories to that other world and helping build their capacity and widening that circle. How has that changed? I think it's been interesting. I am coming in as a newbie and cultivating that network. I have more of a network of interested people now. So I am engaging with more people today than I was 4 years ago. But equally, I think some movements are happening in the education space where we're talking. So there's a really long way to go. But the fact that there are movements to make NEP come alive means there's some work that is happening. And there are like these bright sparks. So it's not like the whole sector is lit up, but there are bright sparks where the policy level, there's some changes that need to be made that need to trickle down, but some who are willingly, proactively stepping up. Because we live in 2025 and social media and information is so easily available, I think there is more self-identification of people being divergent and therefore self-advocacy from people who can represent their own stories. And with more of that happening, this conversation is also getting to be mainstream. I have to credit Amir Khan and all the movies he's done. Bringing those stories in mass media is important and starts those conversations too and makes it relatable. So, Sabka Apna Normal Hai is a very strong message. Sabka Apna Normal Hai. That's very important. I think there are these bright sparks, and together, I hope over a period of time, it changes things more significantly.
We spoke about advocacy. We recently had a conversation where we were talking about how exhausting advocacy can be and how mentally and emotionally draining it can be. And you have parents in the disability space taking that role. What has that been in terms of your experience, in terms of what advocacy has looked like and how challenging it can be, or how exciting it can be when you have the right team come together?
I think we're fortunate because as an organization, we're very much focused on the allyship and advocacy work. I see our work at Inclusive Dunia. There's a lot of these organizations that focus on vocational training or employability for neurodivergent folk. Each of them do their own awareness building work, but as an organization with Inclusive Dunya, we're dedicated to running that campaign. So it's almost like an overarching thing that represents and supports all of those needs and takes those stories. So because one program of ours is completely dedicated to that, I think it gives us more space as well to talk about this than other organizations would have. And they do a brilliant job of it, but just by virtue of the fact that we are 100% focused on one program to do only awareness building and advocacy, it makes it easier. A lot of our work is about micro advocacy, saying if something doesn't go right, what is it that you can do? How can you show up in small ways? Why is this kid not in the class? Why is this kid being bullied in the classroom, in the playground? Why is this, what does a condominium mein Diwali party look like? Um, and that micro advocacy, I think because we work grassroots up, we engage with families, and typically the families that come to us are facing challenges. So, on this part of it, I think I have also learned that while I may not have primary care responsibilities for my sibling, and we don't necessarily work with neurodivergent folk directly as a vocational training school like Muskan, where I was working earlier, does. This is also emotionally involved work. And it is important for me and my team to look after ourselves through that. So, just as an example, over the weekend, we recently started some sibling care work and we ran that. And it very deeply impacted one of my team members who probably never sat and heard those sibling stories. While she's very sensitive and very aware of some of these things theoretically, but to actually see siblings sit in a circle and share some of these stories moved her to a point where I was like, let's just order some ice cream. And self-care can look like an ice cream, but self-care can also look like what sort of distance would you need to look at this objectively and not be drawn into the emotional exhaustion of it. Because this work that needs to be done over a period of time, and what we need within Inclusive Dunya, within my team, but also the more extended team of allies, is people who have the ability to also emotionally sustain it. So knowing when you can step in and give more and when you can step back and need a breather, whether it is for one weekend or for a month, is important. That awareness is important. It is emotionally involved.
I see a new campaign that you're running Tuesdays with Teachers, which has bite sized information for teachers and it's really
Yes.
well done. And there's a lot of content that you guys have been creating. And I really hope that keeps going out more and more so that we all start learning to become these little tiny allies. And I think the world changes when we
Does.
are all allies.
And which very good example of where we're also trying to circumvent the system because it's not always the schools would make space for teachers to take on this kind of training, but a teacher who is facing a challenge in the classroom and is looking for content and does not find India specific content or India content that fits the Indian context with the large classroom sizes or low resource settings, they will find content from overseas where you have 25 to 30 people in a classroom and a lot of use of technology. The solutions there look very different than what they need to look over here. So the intent with Tuesdays for Teachers is to put out this bite-sized content to build their capacity, not have the school management or DOE gatekeep that access to support, even for the teacher, because the teacher is also an ally.
We have hopefully neurodivergent adults listening in. Is there a message that you have for them?
I hope this lands well, but very often, you know, as we discover our neurodivergence, and as I speak as somebody who has been diagnosed as an adult and has gone on this journey of self-awareness and self-advocacy after I started Inclusive Dunya. So that's interesting. But I would say take the time that you need to anchor into your whole being. And I think what happens over a period of time is that we think of ourselves as less than or less capable or lazy. And I think we need to drop some of the self-talk and self-labeling and learn to embrace ourselves with self-compassion and then not fight the world. I think in this journey we have to find our own tribe of supporters, and there will be people as you advocate for yourself, the space that you need. There will be some old relationships that drop away, but equally there will be very many meaningful new relationships that will come your way. Be willing to embrace those because it gets more beautiful as you anchor it to your whole self and not fight against your natural instincts.
Messages for the neurotypical.
Messages for the neurotypical. I think this probably is a more generic message with any kind of diversity that I would say be curious and know that feel good to anyone. So, with any work that we do, we always start with asking, you don't need to know what being autistic feels like. You need to just think of that one time where you felt like you would be included and you weren't. What did that feel like? With that as a starting point, could you show up differently for somebody who does not very easily fit into your current setup, whatever that homogeneity is that you're working with? One is that. And second is that diversity just makes it richer. Diversity in our friend circle, employee circle, or teams makes work, life, conversations much richer. Somebody who sees the world differently may be able to come and tinker and fix your TV in a way that you may not be able to. Be curious and make the space to engage with that diversity and let it enrich your life.
And the final question, what does a truly inclusive dunya look like to
Truly
you?
inclusive dunya and is a dunya where we don't have to have these conversations, where we're talking about differences, where we don't think about something as being typical and divergent. We just see it as being diversity, where each individual has a role to play, has a space to play that role and flourish and thrive. And we don't need to have these conversations because while these conversations are very important, and that is the part of the journey we're in right now, I think where we need to get is that, like you talked about, it is not something that you design for that one person who's left out. You design for diversity from the outset. And that design refers to conversations, it refers to social life, it refers to education, employment, absolutely every aspect of society. When we talk about accessibility, we're talking accessible infrastructure, but we have to think about accessibility in every possible way. So, in every aspect of life. And I think that's what an inclusive dunya is, where we don't have to talk about who's left out.
Thank you so much for your time, Pooja. I really wish we didn't have to have these conversations and everyone had a space and everyone was equally important. We could just be the way that we want to be. We could show up in any way. We could take space and we were all perfectly included and we all belong. And your work, and I've been going through it for some time now, building up to this episode, it's just been fabulous. And I'm very glad I get to look up to you on this journey and reach out to you whenever I'm stuck and needing guidance. I love the perspective that you've been able to bring, which is of a special sibling. I know you're not primary caregiver as such, but it takes a lot and it gives you a lot. And that's journeys where Inclusive Dunya and Sarvodya has been being a special sibling.
For
Thank you
having
so
me,
much.
and for having these conversations and taking them to places where people wouldn't be listening. So, really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you so much. As Pooja says, neuro inclusion isn't the job of experts alone, it's a shared responsibility. The world needs allies. Whether you're a teacher, a friend, a colleague, or just someone who wants to do better, inclusion starts with you. Micro actions that make a difference. If you'd like to learn more about the Sarvodya Collective or join the Inclusive Dunya campaign, you'll find the links in the show notes. Until next time, I'm Ann Thomas, and this was Just Your Normal Misfit. Let's keep creating a world where everyone, no matter how their brain works, feels seen, supported, and safe.